Such an edifice, with its spectral peaks, its clustered chimneys, its overhanging second story, its grotesque corner brackets, its diamond-paned lattice windows, is indeed an object well calculated to evoke sombre reflections, typifying, as it does, the dark Puritan age of concealed horror and witch whispers, which preceded the beauty, rationality, and spaciousness of the 18th century. Hawthorne saw many in his youth, and knew the black tales connected with some of them. He heard, too, many rumors of a curse upon his own line as the result of his great-grandfather's severity as a witchcraft judge in 1692. From this setting came the immortal tale, New England's greatest contribution to weird literature. And we can feel in an instant the authenticity of the atmosphere presented to us. Stealthy horror and disease lurk within the weather-blackened, moss-crusted, and elm-shadowed walls of the archaic dwelling so vividly displayed, and we grasp the brooding malignity of the place when we read that its builder, old Colonel Panchion, snatched the land with peculiar ruthlessness from its original settler, Matthew Mallet, whom he condemned to the gallows as a wizard in the year of the panic. Mallet died, cursing old Panchion. God will give him blood to drink, and the waters of the old dwell on the seized land turn bitter. Miles, carpenter's son, consented to build the great gabled house for his father's triumphant enemy. But the old colonel died strangely on the day of its dedication. Then followed generations of odd vicissitudes, with queer whisperings about the dark powers of the malice and peculiar and sometimes terrible ends befalling the Panchions. The overshadowing malevolence of the ancient house, almost as alive as Poe's house of Usher, though in a subtler way, pervades the tale. As a recurring motif, pervades an operatic tragedy, and when the main story is reached, we behold the modern Panchions in a pitiable state of decay. Poor old Hepzibah, the eccentric, reduced gentlewoman, childlike, unfortunate Clifford, just released from undeserved imprisonment, sly and treacherous Judge Panchion, who is the old colonel all over again. All these figures are tremendous symbols and are well matched by the stunted vegetation and anemic fowls in the garden. It was almost a pity to supply a fairly happy ending with the union of sprightly Phoebe, cousin and last scion of the Panchions, to the prepossessing young man who turns out to be the last of the Mouths. This union presumably ends the curse. Hawthorne avoids all violence of diction or movement, and keeps his implications of terror well in the background, but occasional glimpses amply serve to sustain the mood and redeem the work from pure allegorical aridity. Incidents like the bewitching of Alice Panchion in the early 18th century and the spectral music of her harpsichord, which precedes a death in the family, the latter a variant, of an immemorial type of Aryan myth, link the action directly with the supernatural, whilst the dead nocturnal vigil of old Judge Pincheon in the ancient parlor, with this frightfully ticking watch, is stark horror of the most poignant and genuine sort. The way in which the judge's death is first adumbrated by the motions and sniffing of a strange cat outside the window, long before the fact is suspected either by the reader or by any of the characters, is a stroke of genius which Poe could not have surpassed. Later, the strange cat watches intently outside that same window in the night and on the next day. For something, it is clearly the psychopomp of primeval myth, fitted and adapted with infinite deftness to its latter-day setting. But Hawthorne left no well-defined literary posterity. His mood and attitude belong to the age which closed with him, and it is the spirit of Poe who so clearly and realistically understood the natural basis of the horror appeal and the correct mechanics of its achievement, which survived and blossomed. Among the earliest of Poe's disciples may be reckoned the brilliant young Irishman Fitz James O'Brien of 1828 through 1862, who became naturalized as an American and perished honorably in the Civil War. It is he who gave us What Was It?, the first well-shaped horror story of a tangible but invisible being, and the prototype of De Maupassant's Horla, he also who created the inimitable diamond lens, in which a young microscopist falls in love with the maiden of an infinitesimal world, which he has discovered in a drop of water. O'Brien's early death undoubtedly deprived us of some masterful tales of strangeness and terror, though his genius was not, properly speaking, of the same Titan quality which characterized Poe and Hawthorne. Closer to real greatness was the eccentric and saturnine journalist Ambrose Bierce, born in 1842, who likewise entered the Civil War, but survived to write some immortal tales and to disappear in 1913 as in a great cloud of mystery as any he ever evoked from his nightmare fancy. Bierce was a satirist and a pamphleteer of note, but the bulk of his artistic reputation must rest upon his grim and savage short stories, a large number of which deal with the Civil War and form the most vivid and realistic expression which that conflict has yet received in fiction. Virtually all of Bierce's tales are tales of horror, and whilst many of them treat only of the physical and psychological horrors within nature, a substantial portion admit the malignly supernatural, and form a leading element in America's fund of weird literature. Mr. Samuel Loveman, a living poet and critic who was personally acquainted with Bierce, thus sums up the genius of the great shadow maker in the preface to some of his letters. In Bierce, the evocation of horror becomes, for the first time, not so much the prescription or perversion of Poe and Maupassant, but an atmosphere definite and uncannily precise, words so simple that one would be prone to ascribe them to the limitations of a literary hack, take on an unholy horror, a new and unguessed transformation. In Poe, one finds it a tour de force, and Maupassant a nervous entanglement of the flagellated climax. To Bierce, simply and sincerely, diabolism held in its tormented depth a legitimate and reliant means to the end, yet a tacit conformation with nature is in every instance insisted upon. In the death of Halpin Fraser, flowers, verdure, and the boughs and leaves of trees are magnificently placed as an opposing foil to unnatural malignity, not of the accustomed golden world, but a world pervaded with the mystery of blue and breathless recalcitrance of dreams, is Bierce's. Yet, curiously, inhumanity is not altogether absent. The inhumanity mentioned by Mr. Loveman finds vent in a rare strain of sardonic comedy and graveyard humor, and a kind of delight in images of cruelty and tantalizing disappointment. The former quality is well illustrated by some of the subtleties in the darker narratives, such as one does not always eat what is on the table, describing a body laid out for a coroner's inquest, and the man, though naked, may be in rags, referring to a frightfully mangled corpse. Bierce's work is in general somewhat uneven. Many of the stories are obviously mechanical and marred by a jaunty and commonplace artificial style derived from journalistic models, but the grim malevolence stalking through all of them is unmistakable, and several stand out as permanent mountain peaks of American weird writing. The Death of Halpin Fraser, called by Frederick Tabor Cooper the most fiendishly ghastly tale in the literature of the Anglo-Saxon race, tells of a body skulking by night without a soul in a weird and horribly ensanguined wood, and of a man beset by ancestral memories who met death at the claws of that which had been his fervently loved mother. The damned thing, frequently copied in popular anthologies, chronicles the hideous devastations of an invisible entity that waddles and flounders on the hills and in the wheat fields by night and day. The suitable surroundings evokes, with singular subtlety, yet apparently simplicity, a piercing sense of the terror which may reside in the written word. In the story, the weird author Colston says to his friend Marsh, "You were brave enough to read me in a streetcar, but in a deserted house alone in the forest at night." Bah. I have a manuscript in my pocket that would kill you. Marsh reads the manuscript in the suitable surroundings, and it does kill him. The middle toe of the right foot is clumsily developed, but has a powerful climax. A man named Manton has horribly killed his 2 children and his wife, the latter of whom lacked the middle toe of his right foot. 10 years later, he returns, much altered to the neighborhood, and being secretly recognized as provoked into a bowie knife duel in the dark, to be held in the now abandoned house where his crime was committed. When the moment of the duel arrives, a trick is played upon him, and he is left without an antagonist, shut in a night-black ground-floor room of the reputedly haunted edifice, with the thick dust of a decade on every hand. No knife is drawn against him, for only a thorough scare is intended, but on the next day he is found crouched in a corner with distorted face, dead of sheer fright at something he has seen. The only clue visible to the discoverers is one having terrible implications in the dust of years that lay thick upon the floor, leading from the door by which they had entered straight across the room to within a yard of Manton's crouching corpse were 3 parallel lines of footprints, light but definite impressions of bare feet, latter ones, those of small children, the inner of women's. From the point at which they ended, they did not return. They pointed all one way, and of course the women's prints shewed a lack of the middle toe of the right foot. The spook house, told with a severely homely air of journalistic verisimilitude, conveys terrible hints of a shocking mystery. In 1858, an entire family of 7 persons disappears suddenly and unaccountably from a plantation house in eastern Kentucky, leaving all its possessions untouched: furniture, clothing, food supplies, horses, in the deserted dwelling, and in so doing stumble into a strange subterranean room, lit by an unaccountable greenish light, and having an iron door which cannot be opened from within. In this room lie the decayed corpses of the missing family, and as one of the discoverers rushes forward to embrace a body he seems to recognize, the other is so overpowered by a strange voiture that he accidentally shuts his companion in the vault and loses consciousness. Recovering his senses 6 weeks later, the survivor is unable to find the hidden room, and the house is burned during the Civil War. The imprisoned discoverer is never seen or heard of again. Bierce seldom realizes the atmospheric possibilities of his themes as vividly as Poe, and much of his work contains a certain touch of naivety. Prosaic angularity. Our early American provincialism, which contrasts somewhat with the efforts of latter horror masters, nevertheless the genuineness and artistry of his dark intimidation, his dark intimations are always unmistakable, so that his greatness is in no danger of eclipse. As arranged in his definitely collected works, Bierce's weird tales occur mainly in 2 volumes, Can Such Things Be? And In the Mist of Life. The former, indeed, is almost wholly given over to the supernatural. Much of the best in American horror literature has come from pens not mainly devoted to the medium. Oliver Wendell Holmes's historic Elsie Venner suggests with admirable restraint an unnatural Othnian element in a young woman prenatally influenced, and sustains the atmosphere with finely discriminating landscape touches. In the turn of the screw, Henry James triumphs over his inevitable pomposity and prolixity sufficiently well to create a truly potent air of sinister menace, depicting the hideous influence of 2 dead and evil servants, Peter Quint and the governess, Miss Jessel, over a small boy and girl who had been under their care. James is perhaps too diffuse, too unctuously urbane, and too much addicted to subtleties of speech to realize fully at the wild and devastating horror in his situations. But for all that, there is a rare and mounting tide of fright, culminating in the death of the little boy, which gives the novelette a permanent place in its special class. F. Marion Crawford produced several weird tales of varying quality, now collected in a volume entitled Wandering Ghosts. For the blood is the life, touches powerfully on a case of moon-cursed vampirism near an ancient tower on the rocks of the lonely South Italian seacoast. The Dead Smile treats of family horrors in an old house and ancestral vault in Ireland, and introduces the banshee with considerable force. Bepper, however, is Crawford's weird masterpiece, and is one of the things as the spectral saltwater dampness, the strange open portal, and the nightmare struggle with the nameless object are handled with incomparable dexterity. Very genuine, though not without the typical mannered extravagance of the 1890s, is the strain of horror in the early work of Robert W. Chambers, since renowned for products of a very different quality. The King in Yellow, a series of vaguely connected short stories having as a background a monstrous and suppressed book whose perusal brings fright, madness, and a spectral tragedy, really achieves notable heights of cosmic fear in spite of uneven interest and a somewhat trivial and affected cultivation of the Gallic studio atmosphere made popular by de Maurier's Trilby. The most powerful of its tales, perhaps, is The Yellow Sign, which is introduced a silent and terrible churchyard watchman with a face like a puffy grave worm's, a boy describing a tussle he has had with this creature, shivers and sickens as he relates a certain detail. Well, sir, it's God's truth that when it in it grad me wrist, sir, when I twisted his soft, mushy fist of one of its fingers came off in me, and an artist who, after seeing him, has shared with another strange dream of a nocturnal hearse, is shocked by the voice with which the watchman accosts him. The fellow emits a muttering sound that fills the head like thick, oily smoke from a fat-rending vat, or an odor of noisome decay. What he mumbles is merely this: "Have ye found the yellow sign?" A weirdly hieroglyphed Onk's talisman, picked up in the street by the sharer of his dream, is shortly given the artist, and after stumbling queerly upon the hellish and forbidden book of horrors, the two learn, among other hideous things, which no sane mortal should know, that this talisman is indeed the nameless yellow sign handed down from the accursed cult of Hastur, from primordial Carcosa, whereof the volume treats, and some nightmare memory of which seems to lurk, latent and ominous, at the back of all men's minds. Soon they hear the rumbling of the black-plumed hearse, driven by the flabby and corpse-faced watchman. He enters the night-shrouded house in quest of the yellow sign. All bolts and bars rotting at his touch, and when the people rush in, drawn by a scream that no human throat could utter, they find three forms on the floor, two dead and one dying. One of the dead shapes is far gone in decay. It is the churchyard watchman, and the doctor exclaims, "That man must have been dead for months." It is worth observing that the author derives most of the names and allusions connected with his eldritch land of primal memory from the tales of Ambrose Bierce and other works of Mr. Chambers, displaying the outer and macabre element, are The Maker of Moons and In Search of the Unknown. One cannot help regretting that he did not further develop a vein in which he could so easily have become a recognized master. Horror. Material of authentic force may be found in the work of the New England realist Mary E. Wilkins, whose volume of short tales, The Wind in the Rosebush, contains a number of noteworthy achievements. In The Shadows on the Wall, we are shown with consummate skill the response of a staid New England household to uncanny tragedy, and The Sourceless Shadow of the Poisoned Brother well prepares us for the climactic moment when the shadow of the secret murderer who has killed himself in a neighboring city suddenly appears beside it. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, in The Yellow Wallpaper, rises to a classic level in subtly delineating the madness which crawls over a woman dwelling in the hideously pampered room where a madwoman was once confined. In The Dead Valley, the eminent architect and medievalist Ralph Adams Cram achieves a memorably potent degree of vague regional horror through subtleties of atmosphere and description. Still further carrying on our spectral tradition is the gifted and versatile humorist Irvin S. Cobb, whose work, both early and recent, contains some finely weird specimens. Fishhead, an early achievement, is banefully effective in its portrayal of unnatural affinities between a hybrid idiot and the strange fish of an isolated lake, which, at the last, avenge their biped kinsman's murder. Later work of Mr. Cobb introduces an element of possible science, as in the tale of the hereditary memory, where a modern man with a negroid strain utters words in African jungle speech when run down by a train under visual and aural circumstances, recalling the maiming of his black ancestor by a rhinoceros a century before. Extremely high in artistic stature is the novel The Dark Chamber of 1929 by the late Leonard Klein. This is the tale of a man who, with the characteristic ambition of the Gothic or Byronic hero-villain, seeks to defy nature and recapture every moment of his past life through the abnormal stimulation of memory. To this end he employs endless notes, records, mnemonic objects, and pictures, and finally odors, music, and exotic drugs. At last his ambition goes beyond his personal life and reaches toward the black abysses of hereditary memory and even back to pre-human days amidst the steaming swamps of the Carboniferous age, and to still more unimaginable depths of primal time and entity. He calls for madder music and takes stronger drugs, and finally his great dog grows oddly afraid of him. A noxious animal stench encompasses him, and he grows vacant-faced and subhuman. In the end, he takes to the woods, howling at night beneath the windows. He is finally found in a thicket, mangled to death. Beside him is the mangled corpse of his dog. They have killed each other. The atmosphere of this novel is malevolently potent. Much attention is paid to the central figure's sinister home and household. A less subtle and well-balanced, but nevertheless highly effective creation, is Herbert S. Gorman's novel, The Place Called the Gone, which relates the dark history of a western Massachusetts backwater where the descendants of refugees from the Salem witchcraft still keep alive the morbid and degenerate horrors of the Black Sabbath. Sinister House by Leland Hall has touches of magnificent atmosphere, but is marred by a somewhat mediocre romanticism. Very notable in their way are some of the weird conceptions of the novelist and the short story writer, Edward Lucas White. Most of the themes arise from actual dreams. The Song of the Sirens has a very persuasive strangeness, while such things as Lukundu and the Snout rouse darker apprehensions. Mr. White imparts a very peculiar quality to his tales, an oblique sort of glamour which has its own distinctive type of convincingness. Of younger Americans, none strikes the note of cosmic terror so well as the California poet, artist, and fictionalist Clark Ashton Smith, whose bizarre writings, drawings, paintings, and stories are the delight of a sensitive few. Mr. Smith has, for his background, a universe of remote and paralyzing fright, jungles of poisonous and iridescent blossoms on the moons of Saturn, evil and grotesque temples in Atlantis, Lemuria and forgotten elder woods, and dank morasses of spotted death fungi in spectral countries beyond Earth's rim. His longest and most ambitious poem, The Hashish Eater, is in pentameter blank verse and opens up chaotic and incredible vistas of kaleidoscopic nightmare in the spaces between the stars. In sheer demonic strangeness and fertility of conception, Mr. Smith is, perhaps, unexcelled by any other writer, living or dead, who has seen such gorgeous, luxuriant, and feverishly distorted visions of infinite spheres and multiple dimensions, and lived to tell the tale. His short stories deal powerfully with other galaxies, worlds, and dimensions, as well as with strange regions and islands on the Earth. He tells of primal Hyperborea and its black amorphous entity, Tsa Thagua, of the lost continent of Zathaqua, and of the fabulous vampire cursed land of Averroigne in medieval France. Some of Mr. Smith's best work can be found in the brochure entitled The Double Shadow and Other Fantasies of 1933.